All right, so welcome everyone to the Adaptation Planning and Practices for Forest Carbon Management online course for 2022. This is our first week. This is our first session. Session number one focuses on kind of introducing you to the course, introducing you to the adaptation workbook process, and it's kind of a warmer-upper for us. And so it's a little bit different than how we've done these courses in the past. We're going to cover a little bit of the basics of forest carbon, kind of some of the definitions and concepts here in this week. So our agenda for today, I'm going to welcome you to the course, give you some introductions to your course instructors, cover a little bit of sort of the logistics, and then give you sort of that overview of what we're going to be doing over the next 8 weeks of the course. We'll be covering some of the basics of carbon, talking about some of the concepts and definitions that relate to forest carbon, to kind of get us primed for thinking about carbon management. We're going to talk about the Adaptation Workbook. What is the Adaptation Workbook? How are you going to use it to think about climate and climate change adaptation in your project? And then review some of the steps that you'll need to take to create your project in our adaptationworkbook.org website, where you'll be doing a lot of the, you'll be doing all of the work developing your project in the course. All right, so with that, welcome to the course. We have been offering this online course pretty much since 2016 for forestry-focused natural resource professionals who work in kind of a variety of settings, both in kind of rural and urban forestry settings. I'm Todd Ontel. I'm one of your course instructors, along with Luke Nave and Danielle Shannon. We are kind of the leads for your course, but we're not the only people that you're going to interact with throughout our course. So each of the colleagues that you see here will, you'll have opportunities to interact with. Either they'll be leading lectures or discussion sections or checking in with you on your projects. And you can learn more about us at our website, which is listed there at the screen at forestadaptation.org/team. And so I'm just gonna, each of us will just give a really quick introduction. So I'm a climate adaptation specialist with NIAX and with Michigan Tech University. And my role with NIAX is to help coordinate our adaptation work in the New England region, as well as to coordinate our forest carbon management outreach work. And so, Luke, can you give yourself a quick introduction?
Sure, yeah, I'm Luke Nave, staff scientist with NIAX and University of Michigan. I'm a forest ecologist and carbon cycle scientist. I'll be filling in some of the lectures in this course on carbon monitoring, some experimental approaches to understanding forest carbon, and also working to provide support to some of you on your specific projects. Todd's helper.
Luke is the brains behind a lot of our carbon work, and so really glad to have him here. Danielle Shannon normally would be helping to lead this course. She has another commitment today, but we're very thankful that our colleague Patricia has stepped in to kind of help out today. So Patricia, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, everybody. I'm also a climate adaptation specialist with NIAX. I usually coordinate the climate change response framework projects in the Mid-Atlantic and Central apps, and so often help land managers think about climate change and incorporate that into land management. I've also been through this course a number of times, focusing on more general stuff, and so I guess I'll be backup for you guys, and I might see you again. I hope so.
Hope so too. Thanks, Patricia. All right, so before we go any further, I just want to give a really quick land acknowledgement. We like to acknowledge the ancestors of the lands that we all gather on today, as we're coming from many different locations. I am located in southern Maine, and so I'd just like to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Wabanaki people, past and present, who've lived with the land throughout the generations. No expectations here, but I'd like to just invite anybody who wants to, put in the chat, where are you coming from? And, whose ancestral lands were those? I think it's always really interesting to just see where folks are coming from. And we certainly will have a lot more opportunity to learn more about where folks are coming from. All right. So I am just one of our team with Patricia and Luke of folks at NIACS, who include both climate adaptation specialists and researchers. And we provide practical information, resources, and technical assistance related to forest and climate change. And since you are in this course, you are likely familiar with NIACS, but in case this course announcement sort of randomly ended up in your inbox and you found your way here, this is just a brief introduction to our organization. We are led by and funded by the Forest Service, primarily supported through 3 branches of the Forest Service: the Northern Research Station, Eastern Region, and Northeastern Area State and Private Forestry. Our steering committee also includes Indigenous, industry, and academic collaboration to address scientific and management needs in the fields of climate and carbon. And so, as many of you know, much of our work centers really on helping natural resource professionals make climate-informed decisions. So why are we all here today? Well, I think we are all here because we recognize that climate change introduces uncertainty about future conditions. And we recognize that this is going to challenge our traditional expectations of ecosystem management into the future for as long as we're going to be managing these lands. We know that ecosystems will change in response to climate, ways like, shifting species ranges, shifting in wildlife species, as well as tree and plant species, changes in ecosystem species assemblages. Communities are going to look different. And that these also are going to be accompanied by changes in fundamental ecosystem processes, including carbon cycling. And all this means it's going to change how we interact with the land. Basically, climate change is making it more difficult to do the work that we've set out to do. We know that climate is changing and we know it's a problem, but the idea of climate change for many can seem just really big, really complex, and hard to easily fit into the work that we do. And so that is really, what brings us here today in this course. We're here to face these issues head on, and really to learn from each other. So in this course, we're going to guide you through a process to apply a climate change filter to your forest management planning projects. We're going to teach you a process that will help you to adapt and learn how to respond to climate change in a way that supports your unique goals, your goals for carbon, as well as all the other values that you have for your project. All right, so let's dig into some of the course details. Let's see. Okay. But first, I want to establish just some of the expectations for the course up front. First, we're going to expect that you attend all 8 lectures and discussion sessions. Each lecture and discussion class will occur, the lectures will occur on Mondays and at this time, and then the discussions are scheduled for Tuesday and Wednesday mornings from 11 to 12 Eastern. So if you or someone from your group can attend one of these discussion sections, just let us know. We'll kind of try to work with you on that. But I think most folks have accepted those invitations. You can find all these session dates on the syllabus that you should have received. So we're going to try to keep lectures to 30 minutes if possible, but we do, recognize that that's going to be hard, especially for some of these first couple of lectures where we've got a lot to cover. And so we're probably going to take closer to the full hour for this week and possibly next week as well. We do have some bonus lectures that are kind of considered optional, that we're planning to sort of delve into some more of the details related to carbon. Since carbon cycling science and carbon management add on really an additional layer of complexity to the topic. Those will be recorded as well. But the discussion sections on Tuesdays and Wednesdays aren't going to be recorded. That's just really a time for us to get together and learn from each other and discuss. And then in addition to the live sessions, there's going to be outside assignments that'll guide you through new material and the corresponding sections of the adaptation workbook. Really, hopefully actively engage you with some supplementary things like videos, links to additional resources, and provide opportunities for reflection and commentary on kind of the process. You're going to be assigned adaptation workbook steps to complete in kind of the intervening days between those live sessions. And these assignments you should expect to take a few hours to get through. Some of the weeks are going to be more intense than others. All right. I'm sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. This was the slide that I was supposed to have up when I was saying all those things. So, and here is the course format here. And again, this is information that you should have all had sent to you in the syllabus. And just put in the chat box if you haven't gotten this information, this syllabus. All right, so let's kind of dive in then to kind of the overview of adaptation. So what is climate adaptation? Well, adaptation is the adjustment of systems in preparation or response to changing climate conditions. And these are actions that are designed really to intentionally address climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, really focused on sort of helping you meet your goals and objectives for your particular project. A lot of these activities build upon things that we already do: sustainable forest management, conservation, restoration. In most cases, provide a lot of that benefit of helping us to prepare and respond to climate change. And so, much of what we're already doing, already makes sense and is sort of that response to changing climate conditions. But there's really no single solution. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all answer, to integrating climate change into natural resources. The answer ultimately is that it depends upon you. It depends upon all those things, what your values and resources are, where you're working, what are your site conditions, what are you trying to achieve. And so this is really where we're coming from in our approach to adaptation and the adaptation planning process, is that all of these components are guiding us to kind of determine what are the most appropriate adaptation actions that we can take. So that's kind of the introduction to adaptation. Well, how does this all sort of fit in with carbon? Well, we're going to really be exploring that question kind of throughout this course. Certainly talking more about it next week. But in the next few minutes here, I want to kind of just give us that run through of thinking about carbon and getting us set up to think about carbon and have, you know, some of those definitions and concepts as you know, understood by, so we're all kind of on the same page. I think we all kind of recognize that there's been a really noticeable increase in discussion and interest in carbon in forests. And I think that is, you know, in recognition of their importance in climate mitigation. Forests offset somewhere between 12 to 16% of the United States emissions from burning fossil fuels. That range sort of just depends upon the year. This comes from our national greenhouse gas reporting. Forests store over 2/3 of the carbon that is contained within our terrestrial ecosystems. And even more impressive, they represent 90% or so of the land sector's capacity to sequester additional carbon on an annual basis. So people really recognize that to address the climate crisis, you know, we need to not only maintain this carbon mitigation capacity, but, you know, we also need to identify ways that we can be working towards enhancing it. At the same time, though, we also recognize that changing climate represents a risk to forests and a risk to this mitigation capacity. So there's a need to understand, you know, what are those climate risks to carbon? What are the implications for carbon for our current management? You know, what are ways that we can be doing to increase carbon on our lands that don't incur greater risk? So people are kind of coming to this question, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of us are coming to this course from different places, from different interests in carbon. And, you know, just kind of from conversations that I've had with folks, my experience working on this topic for the last few years, you know, I kind of see sort of these three buckets as being sort of representative of a lot of where people's interests lie. Some people are really interested in that question of like, how do I maximize carbon on my property or in this place? So really a focus on like putting carbon on as one of the most important things. On the opposite end of the spectrum, some folks come at this topic, you know, saying, well, this is how we manage our lands, but I really want to know, what does that mean for carbon? What are the implications for how I manage on carbon? And then somewhere in the middle, I think that there's a lot of people that you know, sort of recognize a little bit of each of those. And they're interested in finding ways that they can manage better for carbon, but they also recognize that there are ways that they need to manage their properties for all the other important goals. They have to balance carbon with other things like wildlife or recreation or some other goal. And so they're kind of looking for ways that they can see, where does carbon management align with other goals, and how can they maybe sort of tweak what they're doing to sort of provide a boost to some of the carbon benefits. So we're going to, I think, explore this a little bit more, but I just kind of challenge you all to sort of think as you go through listening to this lecture, as you kind of, you know, go about your day in the coming days, you know, really evaluate sort of where are you coming at this question of forest carbon management? Where do you see yourself falling along this spectrum? Throughout this course, I'm probably going to be referring a lot to just sort of carbon in general, or sometimes say carbon benefits. This is a pretty general term that, in my mind, really represents sort of both carbon storage and carbon sequestration, recognizing that both of these things are interrelated, but they're kind of also, from a scientific point, two different ideas. We kind of treat them differently. Of course, carbon storage is really about the amount of carbon retained in a pool in the forest or in the forest ecosystem. And that is often expressed sort of in a density unit, like, tons per acre or grams per meter squared, something like that. It's a density. Carbon sequestration is a flux. It's a process, right? It's the removing of carbon from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, and as such, it's a rate. It's the amount, the amount of carbon the system gains on a temporal basis. So maybe tons per acre per year. And so I would just encourage you all, as you sort of think about your projects and think about how you kind of communicate or talk about carbon management, to be specific where it's appropriate to be specific. If you're thinking about storage, to emphasize that this is about storage or sequestration. But also, if you're kind of just being general, like we are interested in carbon for our project or carbon benefits, to recognize that you could be talking about either one of those things, and that folks might have more questions about what you mean by that. As I've worked with managers and talked with landowners and foresters in the last few years on this topic, I think the one question I've heard most people ask is kind of this question about how should I manage for carbon? Should I manage for sequestration or should I manage for storage? Recognizing the differences between the two, and also recognizing that different forests provide, benefits, more benefits for one or the other. This is a figure from a landowner guide that we helped create for the Massachusetts DCR that, kind of addresses that, or recognizes that, for older forests, they're really good at storing carbon, but oftentimes on a per acre basis don't provide as much sequestration as younger forests that don't store as much because they're, don't have as much tree biomass in particular, but they're really good at sequestering carbon. Those trees are growing really fast and have high rates of sequestration. So, the answer to this is always like, well, I can't tell you what you should do, A, and B, it really just depends. It depends upon a lot of things, and depends upon your site conditions and your stand characteristics, and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about and kind of wrestle with as we go through kind of taking your projects through the adaptation planning process. So the next, I think, sort of definition or set of definitions that I want to just cover quickly and make sure we're all on the same page. I think we're all probably comfortable with thinking about carbon pools. Just recognizing that there are a lot of different ways that people kind of parse out or bin carbon in forest ecosystems. What I'm showing here is pulled from FIA data. So this is how FIA categorizes carbon pools, and we can look and we can see, we can add these 5 pools together to get an estimate of the total amount of carbon in an ecosystem, and then sort of the proportion of each pool as it contributes to the total. And a lot of those carbon pools are easy to see. We can walk around in the forest and we can kind of see the above ground biomass. We can see the amount of coarse woody debris on the forest floor or snags standing. But some of some of it we can't. Of course, the below ground carbon pools are highly variable in space and difficult to quantify and to really understand sort of the variability. But as you can see, those soil carbon pools are very important. These are just data from an average oak hickory forest in Massachusetts. And we recognize also that those proportions, as well as the total amount of carbon, can really vary depending upon a lot of different things. And this infographic just comes from Ohio State University, and so is looking at kind of I guess like a typical forest in the lake states, and just showing, in those red circles that soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, can be quite a bit higher than what I was showing in that previous figure in oak hickory forests, and even higher than 45% with some soil types. You get into some organic soils, and that can be very high, and that those proportions, in other pools like above ground biomass can be a smaller proportion. So just recognizing that there's a lot of difference between these different carbon pools depending upon where you are. So there's a lot of reasons as to why those differences exist, and this is, just really skimming the surface on that. But we've already sort of recognized that stand age has a big influence on the total amount of carbon, carbon stored in pools, sequestration rates. This is a figure that is some based on plot data, but some statistical modeling just showing that in New England, sequestration rates are very fast below 100 years, that very steep rise in carbon density, and then they really flatten out. And of course, those are modeled results, and so on the ground data, it's probably never going to look that neat and clean, but just kind of showing that general trend. Of course, forest type and forest composition is strongly related to forest type, can really make a big influence. And even within a particular forest type, species composition can vary, and that can influence carbon stocks and sequestration rates as well. Structural diversity is one of those things that can have a subtle but important influence on carbon. Uneven aged conditions that have a lot more sort of layering of the vegetation, more structural complexity, and oftentimes have more carbon than even aged stand conditions, just because you can kind of pack more carbon into the various layers. Of course, disturbance and management, being one type of disturbance, strongly influences carbon benefits, sort of both long-term legacies of past disturbance as well as more recent disturbance, really influences a lot of aspects that directly relate to carbon. Here, showing a fairly dramatic picture of a microburst that happened at Hubbard Brook almost 10 years ago. You can see really impacted the ability of that stand to sequester carbon directly after that storm happened. There's a whole bunch of other things as well, stand density, stocking rates, trees per acre, those sorts of things. I've already mentioned soils, but also recognizing other carbon pools and things like deadwood that can really be influenced by what past legacies of management has looked like, as well as all sorts of other stressors, the things that we as managers, as landowners are thinking about when we're thinking about our forest management, things like invasive plant species, insect pests, deer herbivory. Those things all can really have a strong influence. And so, kind of to come back to this topic of what does carbon have to do with adaptation, when we first really started thinking about this and thinking about working with managers, was because we had a lot of conversations with folks who were saying, look, there's a lot of science out there. There's a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles that talk about carbon management, but really at this very high level, that don't really bring it down to providing useful information to help us figure out what we can do in our on-the-ground management. On the other hand, there's these adaptation resources that are really geared towards that, geared towards helping us think about climate risks and adaptation and helping us get to those on-the-ground actions, but don't necessarily do it in a way to help us think about carbon. And so we began working on the development of this resource, which you will be exposed to, hopefully using throughout this course, what we like to call the Forest Carbon Management Menu, that really takes this approach of finding that overlap, finding those adaptation actions that benefit carbon, or similarly, those carbon management actions that are climate informed. Really with this idea that kind of thinking is what is necessary for producing carbon benefits into the future that are robust and resilient. The way my brain works is to put things into boxes, to categorize them. And I recognize that kind of approach doesn't cover us 100%. So this doesn't work perfectly, but I oftentimes think about this adaptation piece as being largely about avoiding carbon losses. What are our risks to our existing carbon stocks? And the mitigation piece or the carbon management piece about increasing existing carbon stocks or increasing sequestration. And where we find that overlap is then we can also think about things like, well, how can we be setting the system up to be adapted to future conditions so that it can be both, increasing our sequestration rates as well as avoiding those losses from stressors or from disturbances. So just to kind of sum things up here on sort of the introduction to the carbon piece, I want to be very clear about what we are offering here in this course, what this course can do, and what it's really not designed to do, what it can't do. So hopefully from what I've talked about for the last half hour or so, this makes sense. This course really is geared toward helping you kind of understand carbon management, helping you understand sort of the directionality of your management, identifying where those trade-offs exist between your other values or goals that you have and where they sort of align with carbon. Certainly recognizing management actions that helps you to adapt to minimize the risk of carbon losses and help you to kind of brainstorm climate-informed ways to enhance sequestration. This course doesn't get into quantification. It's not introducing modeling. We're not going to be able to help you quantify impacts of various harvest regimes. We're not going to be able to provide you with tools here to estimate, stand level carbon densities from your forest inventory data or remote sense data products. Things that are needed for modeling, such as yield functions, those things are really outside of the scope of this course, and it certainly is could never be a replacement for working with a project developer if you're interested in carbon offsets or carbon markets. That is something that others do and do very well. What we are doing here is really thinking about adaptation from and how to meet carbon goals. All right, and so I am going to now turn things over to my colleague Patricia, who's going to give an introduction kind of to what the adaptation workbook is for the next couple minutes, so you can stop listening to me and hear what Patricia has to say.
Thanks, Todd. Before we dive into the technicalities of actually using the workbook, there was a question in the chat box that maybe you could answer briefly. The question was, wouldn't adaptation sometimes result in carbon loss?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that relates to kind of that last slide. And so, yes, it is true that there are ways, or there are actions that we could be looking towards to be adapting that are going to have short-term, or I should say near-term impacts on carbon, and that would reduce carbon stocks, certainly. And we'll talk more about this next week. I think that the goal is that if carbon is something that you're really thinking about, that by adapting your system or adapting your property to a changing climate, that those carbon stocks would be would regain over time. You would see an increase, and that ideally by reducing your risks to climate impacts and to disturbances, you would likely see a net benefit in carbon in the longer term. But that really kind of gets into sort of those temporal responses and how things change over time. And so that gets into a lot of nuance of carbon responses. But yes, it's important to recognize that there's some adaptation actions that have sort of near-term negative impacts to carbon.
Great, thanks. Luke responded, the short answer could be not necessarily, it depends. You could also say it's complicated. So thanks for answering that.
That is actually the correct answer that Luke gave. It depends.
Great. So yeah, let's focus for just a minute in getting you set up to start entering information into the online adaptation workbook. And just as a reminder, there are detailed instructions on how to do this in your syllabus. And so just find the right section there. There's a couple of important decision points that are noted in your syllabus, and I will also point them out here. So Todd, could you go to slide 35? Or was I supposed to start there?
So you just tell me where you wanted to start.
Sorry, I guess I wasn't clear. Do you want me to start presenting this slide, or were you covering that? Did I skip ahead? I'm so sorry.
That's okay. Yeah. No, if you could just start here. Or
sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
We got our wires crossed here.
The backup is not always on the ball. So okay, great. I am well versed with the adaptation workbook. This workbook was designed to help managers make decisions about climate change impacts and how to address those impacts using adaptation strategies and approaches. And so the workbook itself is very flexible, and it was designed with the recognition that land managers are operating in different ecosystems, different forest types and other habitats. They have very different starting site conditions. And then they also have very different reasons for doing management on their properties. And so for that reason, we couldn't necessarily create a guidebook that laid out all of the answers. And so we designed an adaptation workbook that helps guide you through addressing bite-sized pieces of the process to get you through identifying impacts to your particular site, and then identifying those strategies that are going to help you meet your management goals and objectives while addressing those climate change impacts. And so it's really focused on this project level. It really relies on your experience in this area, the knowledge that you have about your site conditions and the history of management on your property and a lot of other variables. You're the best source of information for filling out the adaptation workbook. And one of the advantages of filling out the adaptation workbook is that it really helps you connect the dots on a lot of these things. So identifying what's important about your site, what those impacts are, and then what you can feasibly do about it. And because, of course, everybody's so different and coming from a different place, we simply can't make recommendations, but we have a lot of the tools and resources on hand to help you make those recommendations for your property. Next slide. So the adaptation workbook is really just a 5-step adaptive management cycle. This might look really similar to other adaptive management cycles that you've used before. This one really just puts a climate focus on your management. So in step 1, we're working through defining your management goals and objectives and your timeline. In step 2, we're assessing the regional climate impacts and vulnerabilities, and then taking it a step farther to really think about how those impacts manifest in your particular site. In step 3, we evaluate our management objectives. Given those vulnerabilities, can we still move forward with those objectives, or do we need to go back to square one and maybe think about how to change those objectives so that they're easier to meet? In step 4, assuming we can go on with our management objectives, we can then use the menus of adaptation strategies and approaches to select adaptation actions that work for your particular situation. And then in step 5, we identify ways that we monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. And so as we move through the course, essentially each week is focusing on one step of the adaptation workbook process. And we're pointing out the different resources that will support the information that you're entering into the workbook. So we're trying to make it bite-sized and easy for you. Next slide. And if you're looking for examples of how other land managers have used the adaptation workbook on their property, you can go to forestadaptation.org/demos. There's a filter on that landing page. You can look if you're looking for a particular ownership type. You can sort that way, or if you're looking for examples in your state, you can look that way. There's just a number of different ways to look at different projects. There's also a keyword filter search. We're kind of limited in the number of keywords, but we have some big ones that folks have often looked for. So if you're looking for, I think, like forested wetlands, for example, you could search for different examples like that. So check those out. Those are great examples and just kind of highlight how folks have addressed climate adaptation in unique ways. Next slide. Okay, so if you have any questions, I think Todd just wanted you to type those into the chat box, and we'll probably try to address some of those at the end of the session. And now I get to dive into showing you how to use the adaptation workbook, the actual nuts and bolts of the online workbook. So first, what you're going to do is go to adaptationworkbook.org. You'll hit the landing screen and you'll just click that big green Get Started button in the middle. So that's going to take you to a page where you do the usual login stuff. You enter your name and email address. You'll choose a password. You'll click some permissions. And notably, so if you're working in a team, right, you have maybe 2 or 3 or more people working on the same project in this course, you're going to want to choose one login and one password to share among all of you so that you can all log into the same project. If you have any questions about that, just let us know. So after you submit your information, you should get a confirmation email, and you'll need to verify your email address before you can log in and add a project. So check your spam folders if you don't receive that verification email in just a few minutes. Occasionally, these verification emails just disappear into the interwebs, and we never see them. So if that happens to you, you can't find it in your spam folder or your inbox, just email Danielle or Todd, and that's easy to fix on our end. We can just make a password for you and email it to you and bypass that whole part of the process. So after you verify your email address, you'll be able to log in and add a project. So we'll just, this is the screen now that you'll see after you're able to log in. And so you'll just click that little gray button that says add a project. And here's where there's an important step. So make sure that you choose the option for adaptation planning and practices, Carbon. That's the only way that your project is going to get connected to the course materials. And we can't go back and fix this. So you need to make sure that you choose that project for the adaptation planning and practices course. So easy stuff. So that will take you to the next screen, which will ask you for more information about your project. So just fill that out however you like. But there's another important selection that needs to be made at the bottom under project type. So here, just make sure that you choose the button for forest carbon management. This is going to be important in later steps when you need to access that menu of adaptation strategies for forest carbon management. That's how we bring that into the system for you. So make sure you select that. Next screen. So after you submit that information, you'll be taken to your project dashboard. And so the first thing that you'll know is the drop-down box that is already open when you land on the page. So this box contains video tutorials that are found in each step, and also some course materials that contain a link to a PDF adaptation workbook cookbook tutorial. So that tutorial will provide a detailed diagram of each step of the adaptation workbook if you just need a little bit more instruction as you go along. So links to all of the tutorials and different resources that are part of the course are also going to be provided each week in a follow-up email. So you'll have to check your email, make sure that you're getting those emails. We use a company called Constant Contact, and some firewalls, some companies have a problem with that. So just let us know if you're not seeing those each week, and we can find workarounds for that as well. So in order to get past all this stuff, you'll need to close the drop-down box before you can continue with the workbook. So just click on this little caret or arrow, and it will condense kind of like a window shade. Next screen. And because your project is part of the online course, you'll see a second pull down box that contains information about the course. And I think there's a little box that you can click on so that it doesn't show up every time you log in and have to close that window shade. But once you close that window shade, then you will go ahead and move to the next slide, please. You'll actually find your progress summary page. Yep, so you go ahead. Oh, there's a lot more animations than I realized. There we go. Okay, so now we're on our project summary page. And so here, I just want to kind of orient you to what you're going to see. You guys are probably still working on your step 1 worksheets, and you don't have any of this figured out yet. So this is just take it all in and don't worry about entering information at this point. So there's the white area of the screen. Well, it'll show you the 5 steps of the workbook in the left side of that white space. And if you click on one of those steps, it'll open up that step in more detail on the right side of that white space. So if you click on step 1 here, you'll open up step 1 on the right-hand side, and then you can start filling out information like your management topics and then the goals and objectives that go under each of those management topics. And at any time, no matter where you are in the workbook, if you get lost or you just need to return to another step really quickly, you have that gray navigation bar on the far left side of the screen. So that shows all the steps of the workbook process. It's just a map of quick links back to where you came from. That'll never go away. And you'll also notice that there are resources that you can access in that panel. And there's also a button to export your plan to a PDF. So some cool stuff there. And so that's it for now. Let us know if you have any problems getting this far. I'm sure folks will cover that in your lecture again next week, but now is just a great time to kind of get in and start poking around in the workbook and learning about the different resources that are contained there. And with that, I will hand it back over to you, Todd.
Awesome, thanks, Patricia. And obviously, I am not good with slide animations. I will work on that for future lectures. Yeah, so that's the quick spin through getting set up. As Patricia mentioned, we're not at the step of actually, going in and working on your step 1 stuff. So don't worry about that right now. This first lecture here was really just to get us oriented to things, and we'll talk more about step 1 in our discussions sessions Tuesday and Wednesday. So just to wrap up here and try to keep us on time as close as possible, your assignment for next week is really just read. Familiarize yourself with the topic, make sure you're up to speed. So the course syllabus has got great information, a lot of what we've already covered here today. There's a whole bunch of carbon topic pages on the Climate Change Resource Center website. Explore those. None of them take very long to read. Just good basic information. We've got a really neat interactive education module that is linked in the course materials as well. And then just make sure you can get into the adaptation workbook into your account and kind of get things set up, get your projects set up. We just want to make sure if there's any technical difficulties that we can be working with you to figure those out. And that's not holding you back. And so, yes, as I mentioned, we've got discussion sessions this week, tomorrow and Wednesday. We want to just hear from you. We want to hear a little bit about what your project is and sort of where you're coming from with your interests in carbon. And then next Monday, this time on March 28th, is when we're really going to dive into those step 1 goals and objectives, and really make sure that those are clarified and kind of at just the right level, so that you can really effectively work in the adaptation workbook through your project. So with that, I'll thank you all. We're going to stop the recording now, and then we can just kind of open up for questions if people want to hang on. So have a great week. And